Well, let's look at virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is um, the first normative theory that we're going to be looking at in this course. And it's important to note that virtue ethics, as well as every other one of these normative theories that we're going to start looking at now, are realist theories. So they fall under the category of realism and cognitivism. So every one of these theories assumes that moral claims are either true or false. In other words, they can have and do have cognitive content. They're not just your expression of some sort of preference or desire or emotion, anything like that, but that it's describing the real things in the world or not, right? Either it's true or false. They assume that, and they also assume that it's part that what makes moral claims true has to do with reality itself, that there indeed is a sort of framework or structure. A fancy word that philosophers often use is ontology, that there's an ontology to the world such that uh, moral claims um, and morality itself is as real a part of this world as gravity, as inertia, um, as H2O, or as the humidity in the South that we all are very aware of, right? It's as real as that sort of thing. Uh, that's not necessarily to imply that it's easy to figure out or determine or to discover per se, or to be completely confident in it, right? Those are more psychological, epistemological aspects of it. Realism doesn't go that far, right? That's a little bit different of an issue, but nonetheless, these are realist theories that indeed morality is real. It's a real thing in the world, and it's independent of human beings, right? And that's the crucial thing here. It's independent of us. Humans discover it, or hopefully we do, but we don't create it. Okay. So, of these three theories, we're looking at virtue ethics. It's the oldest one, which is why I like to start with it for the most part, usually. And the particular model that we're going to be looking at here of virtue ethics is Aristotle's version of virtue ethics. Why Aristotle? Well, for the most part, because Aristotle is the oldest thinker who articulates a very robust and exhaustive um, uh, theory of virtue. That's the thing about it. It's just very um, uh, spelled out for Aristotle. Of course, he's a philosopher from about 300 to 400 BC, a student of Plato's, crucially important philosopher. I'll not go into the life of Aristotle, but he's crucially important for um, coming up, or at least recording a lot of the ideas that have been very influential in Western civilization. And I would say right up there with all those ideas, indeed, is his theory of virtue. So let's talk about it here a little bit. What is virtue ethics? I mean, if I'm going to try to figure out how to solve some moral problem, then how am I going to use this theory to help me do so? And notice that question I just asked is a very American kind of question. And there's a sense in which, a very Western kind of question, and there's a sense in which even asking it sort of shows my cards that might be somewhat, that a true Aristotelian virtue ethicist might be a little bit resistant to engage with, because it's the sort of wrong question to ask. And I'll explain why that's the case. So some things to know about virtue ethics. It's the oldest normative theory, and I want to clarify that by saying this, that at least that we kind of know of, or at least the oldest normative theory that's been exhaustively laid out, right? Um, Apart from holy books like the Old Testament, which has a sort of moral theory of a similar but a different kind as well. So besides those kinds of things, just sort of a pure secular philosophical theory, it's the oldest one that we have on record that's been spelled out exhaustively. And this is really crucial now for understanding how virtue ethics is and how it works. It's really concerned more with people's character than with their actions. Okay. One way that this often gets explained when by virtue theory, well, and let's use the trolley problem for an example here. The trolley problem is something that we've looked at a little bit already, and right, it's the problem of the trolley that's going down the track. It's going to run over five people. However, there's a side track that the trolley could be diverted onto that only has one person, right, laying on it. So what do? Do you just allow the trolley to do what it's going to do on its own, or do you get involved in order to save the life of four people, right? So, we are Westerners. We are very pragmatic in how we think. We're very practical. The question is, okay, what's the right action here? Uh, virtue ethics is not so much concerned with the right actions, although I mean, virtue ethics is concerned with correct actions. Don't get me wrong. However, it's not actions themselves that necessarily are morally right or wrong. It's character that lends right or wrong, or good or bad moral assessment to actions. In other words, morality is not the sort of thing that can be atomized into specific actions. That that morality is a right action here and a right action there. No, for virtue ethics, morality itself is encapsulated, it's embodied, if I want to use that terminology, in good character, in the character of a good person. So, so here might be a helpful analogy. Whereas, right, Western Americans like us, Westerners who are Americans like us, will say, um, uh, we'll ask the question, and try to figure out the, the moral solution. We'll say, what's the right thing to do in this situation? What the virtuous ethicist is going to ask is, what would the virtuous person do in this situation? And notice that those questions are very different, right? There's some sort of similarity there, but they're very different. Whereas I'm going to say, what's the right action? The virtue ethicist is going to say, what would the virtuous person do here, right? That's really important. Right action then is not the sort of thing, and I've already said this, but it's not the sort of thing that's atomized. It's not the sort of thing that um, is independent of people, as if it's some sort of formula that exists in an a priori world, and you just sort of figure out what that formula is so that you can do it. Right action itself is derived from being a virtuous person. Now, you may have read this in the textbook or other readings about the story of Helen, that is represented. And basically, what the idea is that it's that Helen overhears her roommate talking about some lying and cheating or stealing or whatever it is that she's going to do, um, and is very disappointed in her friend. She's not necessarily being all judgy, right? She's not getting all judgy on her friend, because, as we know, right, that's the unpardonable sin, right? No one is allowed to be judgy. Uh, Even though the American justice system obviously is, right, pun intended, judgy, right? There are aspects of society that need to be judgy. Um, so she's not being judgy in that sort of nasty sense, but what this conversation, or this stuff that she's overheard her roommate talk about, overheard her friend talk about, has revealed to her some things about her friend's character. Now that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Her friend hasn't done anything wrong yet, but her friend is scheming about doing some wrong things. And what that does is that tips Helen off as to what her friend's character actually is, what her moral disposition actually is, what are the kind of ideas and future actions that her friend is cultivating in herself, right? And it's bad stuff. So that's very disappointing. And this example really is just used to help point this out. That is that virtue itself and virtue ethics, um, uh, is concerned with, it's about understanding what are the mental states that we have that might instigate the actions that we perform. So we will look at a definition of virtue here fairly soon. Actually, yeah, I've got it right here. Um, so look at this really quickly with me, as Lewis Vaughan defines it. And this is a good little definition of virtue, that it's a stable disposition to act and feel according to some ideal or model of excellence. And notice that definition. And this, again, this comes from Aristotle. This is Vaughan's really nice way of processing the big long definition of Aristotle, which we will look at here, in due time. But a virtue is a stable disposition. Another way to think about what that is something like a character trait. It's a disposition. It's a way in which you are disposed to both act and feel, as the next part of that definition goes. So virtue then is more than just acting out good stuff, but it's actually has to do with sort of your feelings in terms of your desires, your will, what you have cultivated in yourself to be predisposed to do. Okay. So a virtue is going to be that. So that's why in the earlier line I say that it's concerned with mental states that instigate action. And by mental states, we mean, right, the kinds of things that indeed are going to get you to act a certain way or feel a certain way. What it is that you're cognizing in your mind in order to perform some sort of deed. Okay. So yeah, a stable disposition or character trait to act and feel according. Okay, or to act and feel. So stop right there. Um, One thing that I will talk about soon is the opposite of virtue, which we often talk about as a vice, or some people will use the term vice. I think the word defect is a little bit better than vice, primarily because vice has a wide range of meanings and sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. So if we think about virtues and their opposite as defects, defects are also a stable disposition to act and feel in a certain way. Okay, so that's where virtues and their opposites share the exact same definition. But the rest of this is specific to virtue, and that is having this character trait or disposition to act and feel according to some ideal or model of excellence. So the idea here is that there are going to be models, or there is a model, or the term that virtue ethicists often use is exemplar. There is this exemplar, or this awesome, perfect example, right? And if indeed you have cultivated mental states in yourself, right, conformed your will, your desires, your actions, your feelings, according to that moral exemplar, to that virtuous exemplar, um, then you have achieved, in a sense, virtue, right? And you will act out in a reliable way, consistently, the virtues. And there are specific ones that Aristotle mentions, which we will look at here in a little bit. So virtuous exemplars are crucial. And there have been all kinds of exemplars throughout history that people have looked at as really incredibly important people, examples of virtue, of the virtuous life that is worth emulating. Think of Jesus. Uh, Given where we live, right? That's a name that's used very often in this part of the country. So yeah, even for those who are not maybe religious in the Christian sense, uh, still might point to the life of Jesus as a really important one. It was a virtuous one, helping people, healing people. Um, Although they generally don't tend to point out the sort of not so nice things about Jesus, turning tables over and telling people to repent or be cast in the lake of fire, things like that. But would like to point out the nice things about Jesus anyway. All right, so a virtuous exemplar in that sense. Gandhi, right? Another crucially a historical figure, crucial exemplar that people look at. Mother Teresa, the late Mother Teresa. Wow, what a virtuous person she was. And probably maybe even in your own context or situations, it seemed like in the family I grew up in, um, there was always a lot of deference to my great grandparents. Um, and I'm thinking of a couple in particular that were pointed out as just being rock solid people that everyone wanted to be like. They were so well respected in their communities and in our larger family, extended family, and those were the virtuous exemplars there. Uh, and what is it that we were told as kids was, oh, when you want to grow up, you want to be like Papa Link, right, or like Mama Zori, right? You want to be like these people, because these are just rock solid exemplars of virtue of the good life. So I think we see that. So maybe you understand a little bit more now. Maybe you can apply it a little bit more personally now as to what's really going on here. It's an old theory, but it's really not all that removed from a lot of the way in which we practice morality or think about it these days. So let's dive into some of the nuts and bolts now of Aristotle's virtue theory. Okay, let's dive into some of this stuff. Um, uh, Somebody asked, what would a virtuous person do in a condition like the trolley situation? That's a great question. I'm going to let you answer that when we get through this lecture, because I would like to know what you think about that. Some people often say that virtue ethics really doesn't provide an answer to that sort of concrete situation. I don't think that that's necessarily correct, that criticism, but it's not as easy. Um, and maybe that's a good thing that it's not as easy. But that is an excellent question. So yeah, I'd like to see what you think
A question.
after working through this stuff. Yes. What's your question?
So, with that question he
Hello.
just asked, so you know, like the term, like, what would Jesus do in that situation? Is that what you would like call upon? Almost like your what's it called? Your model of excellence. Say that is Jesus Christ. So you'd be like, what
Yeah.
would Jesus do in the Trolley situation? Oh, so how would you find that answer? That's hard.
I've never
That's,
heard that particular question. That's awesome. What would Jesus do on the trolley problem?
yeah.
Um, so you're asking me what would Jesus do on the trolley problem?
I guess you'd have to read the word and then go off that.
I think that would be part of it. Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Just,
a good question. But no, you raised a good point. I didn't even think about that. So yeah, if you've ever had a WWJD bracelet, uh, then in a sense you have been practicing virtue ethics. Not because you wear the bracelet, right? But because that's really what that is implying. Is what is this model of excellence doing, and then how can I conform myself to what I've in my actions, my feelings, my behaviors, my character ultimately. How can I conform that to this model of excellence that I have pointed out as being a model of excellence? Yeah, and if you're doing that, then yeah, you really are practicing virtue ethics in that sense. That's a really good example. Does that help answer your question a little bit, or what you were thinking?
did for me, yes, yes.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? I should stop here for a second and allow people to ask. These are really good ideas, good questions. I know you guys are working to try to put this stuff together. Well, let's dive into some of the nuts and bolts then of Aristotle's theory of ethics. And in his really important work entitled The Nicomachean Ethics, and really the reason it's called that is because he had a son named Nicomachus, and in the ancient world it was uh, sort of common practice to name a massive work or to name an important work or a project after someone you love. Not unlike the way that a lot of books, on the third or fourth page of a book, it'll say something like, you know, to my love or something, a dedication. So the book might be dedicated to somebody by the author. So in the ancient world, often this was done just in the title itself. So that's why it's called that. So don't let that throw you for a loop. It's really Aristotle's ethics. It's his theory of morality that he gives in the Nicomachean Ethics. So he starts off his discussion about the norms, the principles, the rules of morality itself by asking this question: what is good? Now, it's a sort of a meta-ethical question, I suppose, which we have looked a little bit at already in this course to try to understand what the nature of morality is. And it's an incredibly difficult question to ask: is what is good? Um, and asking this question, he's not asking what things are good. Right? He's not asking that. He's asking what is good itself. Okay, what is good itself? What is the nature of good? And he points out three different kinds of good in the abstract sense. Three different kinds of things that we would identify as being good. Maybe there are more, but at least there's this. The first one he talks about is that whichever is chosen for the sake of something else. So the way I've got it put here on the slide is the X, right? X means good in the sense given in the context of this sentence. The good that's chosen for the sake of something else. The X that's chosen for the sake of something else. So what might be something that's not necessarily good itself, but uh, well, I shouldn't put it that way. Now I'm just confusing it. But but it's a good that you would choose because really what you're trying to achieve is something else that's really valuable to you. I think probably the best example of this is a root canal, uh, or You can think of other things too, any kind of dental work, frankly. Do people go to the dentist? Well, I shouldn't say that because there will be that one that messes up my example. But usually, do people go to the dentist simply because they want to go and enjoy the intrinsic experience of laying there in the chair and having three people with all kinds of fingers and other things up in your mouth? Um, yeah, it's kind of messed up, isn't it, when you think about it that way? No, the reason we go to the dentist, the reason I had a root canal done many years ago, I was actually in college when I had to have that done, um, is because I didn't want my mouth to rot and fall out of my head, right? So I'm not choosing. So dental work is it's a good thing, not necessarily for itself, but because of what I get out of it. It's for something else. I choose this in order to get something else. Another kind of good that Aristotle identifies is the good that's chosen or that people choose for the sake of something else and for the sake of itself. So it's the sort of thing that has, and here's a really important term, intrinsic value. That is, it has inherent value. There is value, there is enjoyment in and of itself, as well as something else, what it gets you. And here we need to get a little bit more abstract, maybe in our examples to explain this. So usually, what I like to use to explain something like the good of number two is something like health, right? So I would choose health, or I would choose, a healthy lifestyle, for instance. Why? Well, because a healthy lifestyle is very intrinsically valuable in and of itself. It's a good that I can enjoy, as well as for the sake of something else, and that something else might be all kinds of things that health gets me. Right? The ability to do some kinds of activities, the abilities to like run or row or just walk through a field with my dog, throw bumpers and dummies for my retriever, which is something I really enjoy doing. And being healthy is important for that. So uh, there's inherent value in being healthy, but being healthy also gets me other things as well. So health is a good in that sense. But then there's the good Aristotle identifies that's chosen just for the sake of itself. And this is his terminology, chosen for the sake of itself. But the idea here is that there is that kind of good that in and of itself is ultimately valuable, is ultimately good. It doesn't really get you anything else because it's the highest good. And this is what Aristotle identifies and he calls the chief good. Now, I've got the Greek word anglicized here the best I can in English, but the word is eudaimonia that he uses. And I think the Greek word is important to understand. And for the purposes of this course, when I'm talking about this chief good, I'm going to be talking about eudaimonia. Okay, I'm going to use that term. And here's why. Here's why. It's because the closest word in English that we have to anything like this um, is happiness. So there's a sense in which, for Aristotle, the chief good is happiness. That's a legitimate translation of eudaimonia. The problem, however, though, is that in our culture, the term happiness is actually a very shallow term. We use it in a very shallow way. And I think that that just ends up being confusing because we don't all really mean the same thing when we're talking about being happy or enjoying happiness. Okay, so this is really crucial. So I want to use eudaimonia, and probably the best, simplest way that I can explain what eudaimonia is what I have here in parentheses, that this chief good eudaimonia is human flourishing. That is, it is being the best kind of thing that you are, whatever it is that you are. And I'm using those terms carefully because eudaimonia for Aristotle is the sort of thing that can be enjoyed by all kinds of creatures, all kinds of things. But what is going to bind or restrict that is the kind of thing that it is. So there's a sense in which a knife can be eudaimon, and I'll give an example of that here in a little bit. That a knife can flourish, right? Just being a knife, uh, or my vehicle outside can flourish. It can have a sort of eudaimonia, being what it is. Uh, but the kind of flourishing we're talking about, obviously, is human flourishing, being eudaimon. This is what Aristotle calls the only self-sufficient good. So what he thinks then is that the ultimate good, the chief good, the good that really doesn't get you anything else further, right? It's the ultimate to be enjoyed solely for the sake of itself, is to flourish as a human being. It is to be uh, the best kind of thing that you are, given what your design is, given what your purpose or your function is. Um, and so that raises the question, what is the function of a human being? And that's something we got to talk about now. So what is something's good then? If I'm going to try to enjoy this chief good called eudaimonia, well, then I need to sort of figure out how that me as a person can actually do that in the world in which we live. So we have to ask this question, what is something's good? And the way Aristotle answers that is by saying, well, it's its function. You got to look at what something's function is. So what is the function of a man or of a person here? And the terminology he uses is all inclusive. What is the function of a human being? Well, as Aristotle says, it's what he calls the activity of the soul, or an activity of the soul, implying a rational principle. I've got a few of the terms bolded here. It's very important. The idea here is that the ultimate function of what we do as human beings, first of all, is an activity. So it's not static. It's not as though uh, um, we're not paperweights. Our function isn't just to sit and do nothing, right? A very passive, inactive life, right? Our function is not that, but it's an activity. And what is about us that's being active? It's the soul. And don't let that trip you up. What Aristotle means by soul, or what ends up being translated as soul, indeed, all of the ancients, when they talk about the soul, what they mean is probably what we would call the mind nowadays. So it's a mental activity, it's a mind activity, and he gets even more specific. So it's activity of the mind, not for daydreaming, not for sitting around and imagining things per se, not for watching television, but for being rational, implying a rational principle. What he means here is actively engaging in our rational activities. And what he's getting at there is our rational activities for judging things, justifying things, figuring things out, giving explanations for things, all this kind of rational work that human beings can do, specifically because they are specifically rational. Indeed, as Aristotle says, that human beings are the only rational creatures, or the only creatures in the world that have rational capacities. So, given that uniqueness to us, he thinks that that in and of itself points out what our function is, right? Our function is to exercise this, and even more so, right? I mean, one thing I think that's helpful to understand about all of Aristotle's work is that, sure, he's a philosopher, right? He does philosophical work, he argues for positions, but he does so as one observing his society and observing his culture. He's drawing principles on the basis of how people already practice living life. Okay. So this is something he sees people doing, that this is just the function of people, right? Actively engaging their minds to do rational things and figure out problems in a rational way. He already sees them doing this. People can't help themselves from doing this. They can't stop themselves from doing this. This is just the observable function he sees everybody doing. All right, so how can we explain this a little bit more? I think not a bad example anyway, is is to contrast people with knives. Uh, uh, so we will keep this as gruesome less as possible. Think about what the function of a knife is. What is the function of a knife? Um, I'll answer that question because sometimes in class when I ask it, people will say to stab, and I'm like, no, that's no, 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 no. No, a knife, the purpose of a knife is to cut. I been experimenting with some uh, brisket lately in my smoker at home, and I did one over the weekend, and was kind of bummed out because I realized I didn't have a very sharp knife. So here I am trying to slice this brisket without a sharp knife, and it just ended up being a mess. Or if you ever tried to slice a tomato with a dull knife, right, you end up with more tomato sauce or tomato juice than you end up with tomato slices, right? That's the idea here. So the function of a knife is to cut. Makes sense. But we do know that you can have better knives and worse knives. You can have knives that cut well and knives that cut don't. Or That was weird. Knives that don't cut well. Um, Same with people, not cutting, but anyway, right? People who are uh, good at doing rational work, at figuring out problems, at drawing implications, drawing entailments from statements, all kinds of logical work that we do, math, right? All this kind of stuff that requires rationality. People who are better at that, and people who are worse at that. So it's interesting how that we can identify what the function of these two different things are, and yet at the same time note that some do it more excellently than others. Some knives cut more excellently than others. Some people are more excellent rationally than others. So, what's the point to be drawn here? Is that you can indeed identify what the function of these things are, but at the same time, be able to assess them as being excellent at what they do or not excellent at what they do. So, that's the difference then between being a knife and a good knife, or being a person or a man and a good person or a good man here. The idea is that whenever we are able to assess these as being good because they indeed are able to fulfill their function, it's because it has its virtues. So think about the knife again. What is it that makes a knife a good knife? And you're going to say, okay, well, given the examples you've already used, Dr. Ball, a good knife is one that's sharp. Okay, well, there you go. A knife that is sharp, that sharpness is an attribute or it's a character trait of that knife. It's a virtue of knife. It's an excellence of that knife, right? And those all those terms can be used synonymously here. So take a person indeed who has it in them. Their function is to figure stuff out, to engage their minds rationally to figure stuff out. Some people don't do that well, but the ones who do that well, right? Who have those excellences, it's because they have those excellences, they have those virtues, such that they're able to do that well, right? So these things have a function, but in order to assess them at being good at exercising their function, we've got to identify virtues. And so the idea here is too that virtues are necessary for really living out your function well, for doing your stuff well, right? Virtues are necessary for that. So, as I have put here, virtues are excellences that make a thing the best kind of thing that it is. One virtue or excellence of my computer right now is that it's working really fast. It's got a very fast internet connection here on campus, which is lovely. I'm starting to have some issues at home, well, with my service. It's getting a little aggravating. There's some sort of water getting in the line or something, I think, and it affects it at certain times of day. I'll not go there. I'm going to get on the phone later and I'll go there with them people. But yeah, it's when it's working well, it have a clear line, no problems. That's a virtue of it, isn't it? Or if you have a vehicle that runs well, one of the reasons it's going to run well is because it's injecting fuel into the engine and doing a good job of it, because you really need fuel to get into your engine for it to run well, whether you're using a carburetor or a fancy fuel injection system or whatever it is that you're using, right? This is an excellence of that car that makes it function well, that makes it function excellently. So that's going to be a virtue of it. Any questions on this or thoughts? Anything I can help clear up or help think about? Let's dive a little bit in now to Aristotle himself, his definition of virtue. And you're like, well, I thought you already gave us a definition of virtue. Yeah, I gave you Vaughn's short order definition, which is a great definition. But I think it'd be kind of helpful and kind of nice to dig into some of the weeds, or to wade through some of the weeds, which of Aristotle's longer definition of virtue. So one of the things that he says about virtue, about the excellences of being a human being, and we will look at some examples of use for him, and that should help tie some of this stuff together. He says that virtues themselves are developed through habit. Now, what he means by this is not necessarily that so long as you make a habit out of the right thing or a good thing, then you're virtuous, right? It's not necessarily that sort of thing here. But what he says and what he thinks as an observer in his society and his culture is that he's noticed that people who intentionally are working to develop good habits, excellent habits, right? They're trying to cultivate this so that it becomes a part of the normal rhythm of their lives. He says that this is incredibly crucial. Indeed, it's necessary for being a virtuous person. So if we develop virtues through habit, we cultivating this so that it becomes a normal part of the rhythm of our lives, then that's crucial and necessary for eventually becoming a virtuous person. In other words, that's how we're investing in ourselves to do that. To become virtuous is we're investing in ourselves through virtuous habits. Some interesting examples he gives, frankly, is how we just already do life. He says, look at the fact that in free societies, like his Athens at the time, which has laws and it has legislators and it has those who are working uh, to benefit that city state, that society through the rule of law and such, is that what is it that legislators do really? Well, they come up with laws, they come up with guidelines, they come up with commands and dictates for people to follow. Well, what's the point of laws? And that this is where we could get into a real philosophical discussion about this because you might disagree with Aristotle on this, and that's fine. But what he thinks the point of laws are, why in his culture they create laws, is indeed to steer, to guide people into virtue. He says that's really the point of law, is to have these guideposts that have sanctions on the other side of them, such that if you do the crime, if you break the law, then you do the time, right? You pay the punishment. And the idea here is that the punishment should deter us, um, most people anyway, from breaking the law. So the laws form us, they mold us into the image of the law itself, or into the image of the exemplar that the law itself is holding up, that it's pointing us to. That's what legislators do, and that's what parents do as well. Especially if you've got some parents or have had parents or know parents that are real disciplinarians, right? They are going to guide and steer you through certain kinds of habits in order, to the best that they can, uh, help you become a very successful person, develop the things that you need in life to be successful, to be able to eventually mature, to grow up and mature, leave home and go do life, um, and not screw up at it. That's the point. And it's the same idea with our larger society or community as well, right? Right, that we will put social pressure on people to act and live according to a certain way, because the idea is that we want healthy communities, and this isn't necessarily about controlling people as much as it is about guiding people into success, right? So he sees this as happening with virtue, that virtue itself, as it's cultivated into the life of a person, is done through habit, and there's all kinds of guideposts out there that do that for us. It makes us good. Virtue makes people good people. In other words, it's going to be very difficult, and really for Aristotle, it's going to be impossible to be a good person apart from virtue, right? Virtue is necessary for this. Makes you do your work well, he says. I think really what he has in mind here when he says, when he makes this point, that virtue makes you do your work well, is indeed this work of being a rational person, right? This work of being able to, sort of go out and, do the kinds of things, that help you solve problems, and that help you figure out what the right thing to do is in the trolley situation, for instance, right? You're going to have to point to exemplars, or use the exemplar model, as well as consider the right way to express a virtue, and I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute, um, and then sort of determine what that is. But anyway, it's gonna make you do that work well. It's concerned with choice, um, and the next slide is going to help sort of explain this and what I mean by this when I say that it's concerned with choice, because the virtuous person is not one that chooses, how do I put this? The virtuous person never makes the choice between being virtuous or not, or doing the virtuous action or not, right? Hey, if they're virtuous, it means that they're going to do that. They're going to be a stable, reliable, person at being virtuous. But when he says concerned with choice, what he means here, again, the next slide will help with this. The idea is that the virtuous person um, will be able to explain, will be able to justify how a particular action or feeling, behavior is the expression of virtue. And the word he's using here in Greek, and I've got it anglicized here, is orthos logos. The idea here is arthos, right, or mouth. Ortho, we use that to talk about our mouth in English, and logos is an ancient Greek word for word. So word mouth. The idea here is that I can explain, right, what my word is. I can explain what my ultimate justification is, um, for how a particular action expresses a particular virtue. And that is tied to this point here, that virtue lies in a mean relative to us and our situation. That is, that uh, virtue is always the proper balance between two opposite vices, or I said I wasn't going to use that word, didn't I? Two opposite defects. Okay. And I'll get to that slide here in a second to explain that. It's determined rationally in the way that one with practical wisdom would determine it. Again, this is where the idea of an exemplar is really important, because the way in which a virtuous person is going to um, figure out the virtue and how to best express a particular virtue is going to be done the way that an exemplar would. And what is it that an exemplar has? I mean, what is the sort of intellectual virtue or intellectual excellence that the exemplar is going to have? Well, they're going to have a lot of common sense. And this is the idea about what practical wisdom is. They're going to have a lot of wisdom in terms of how to practically practice their virtue, if you don't mind me being redundant there. Practical wisdom is really important. Virtue is regarding passions and actions, and I think that that's really important to understand, that virtues are more than just good actions or good ways by which to act, or good character traits from which to act out certain kinds of things, but they actually have to do as well with our passions, or the word that I used earlier was our feelings, right? Lewis Vaughn's definition, he says it's right. It's the virtues are stable dispositions regarding um, our feelings and actions, or ways to feel and ways to act. And this is a different way of putting that same thing regarding what our passions are. That's going to be Aristotle's terminology for this, for feelings, and by that he means our intentions, our motivations. What is it that's driving us to do actions? So we can talk about virtuous intentions, virtuous motivations before we even act something out, as well as those actions themselves, if they are being derived from virtuous intentions and motivations. So again, yeah, here's a short definition again. It's a stable disposition to act and feel according to some ideal or model of excellence. But let's go back up to these 2 points that I mentioned, right? This here, uh, that virtue is concerned with choice, and it lies in a mean relative to us and our situation. And let me explain what I mean by that. So here, for instance, is a short list of some of the virtues that Aristotle identifies. He identifies more. There have been more recent philosophers in this similar tradition, which is called Neo-Aristotelianism, who have identified way more virtues. Right? Everybody comes up with with their list of virtues they like to talk about. Here's a good one to start with. So notice that a couple things about this, that um, the virtue itself is listed here in this middle column, and that there are two vices on either side. Oh yeah, and I said I wasn't going to really talk about these in terms of vices, and here I have the word even up on this chart. I'm sorry. Um, but I think we know what's going on. You could exchange the word vice for defect, right? On either side of the virtue, there's a defect. So let's look at this top one, and I'll just explain what I mean, how this works. So the virtue of courage, right? Aristotle says that courage is a virtue. It's an excellence of humanity, and I think that a lot of us would agree with that. We admire people who act decisively, courageously in times in which they have to, maybe to save other people's lives, or uh, to help others live better. Think about those who stand up to bullies. on behalf of other people who can't stand up for themselves, right? Take a lot of courage in doing that. We admire that. That's an exemplary trait in people. Well, there's two different ways in which the feeling or the action that can be courage can go wrong. And I think that's important for me to put it that way. Courage itself can never go wrong because courage is always right. But the feeling that instigates courage or the action that could be a case of courage, it's those things that can go wrong. And they can either go wrong in a deficient way, such that you don't have enough of the feeling or action uh, to be courageous in a particular instance, and so it ends up just being cowardice. Or maybe you go way beyond that and it ends up being the feeling or action itself ends up being rash, or what we call bravado, right? Where you went way on past it. Think about what's an example. An example that I use often to describe this is skydiving. Uh, before, interestingly, before I took a job where I live now in Coleman, Alabama, um, I didn't know much about Coleman, except for some reason knew that there was a big skydiving industry out here, and that might be a bit of an exaggeration, or at least that's what I knew Coleman as, because where I lived before in Birmingham, uh, we would see signs all over the place on campus at the university there where I worked a while that said, skydive Coleman, skydive Coleman. So anyway, think about that. I've never done it. I don't even know if my life insurance would cover anything if I did that. There's actually a rider in that says that, right? That's that's not considered normal recreational activity. So I probably won't. But man, what an interesting and fun thing that could be potentially if you've never done it. So think about the person who the three people. There's the courageous person that goes through the training to do it. They get there early for the class. They do maybe a couple exercises on the ground to prepare for some things. They get up there, they follow instructions in the plane, they're up in the air finally. Uh, when the time comes to jump, the instructor says jump, and they do everything right. They jump. I mean, this is a courageous person for doing something like this, because it's a very scary thing to do, but they've done it smartly. They've done it courageously. It's a good thing. Well, think about the person that does all that, and when they get up there, 5, 6,000 feet, however high it is, above the surface of the earth, they just, they're like a dog with its tail between its legs, and they're over in the corner of the plane. They can't even move, right? They have chickened out. They are a coward. Okay. Uh, and we don't mean that in a bad way, not a bad person, just a coward, right? In this case, they are expressing the defect of cowardice here. Well, take somebody then who is expressing the opposite of courage in the excessive uh, sense. So they're exercising a feeling or action of rashness or bravado. That is, I don't know, the example might be they get up there in the plane, and the instructor is getting ready to say jump, and they are just so overconfident, maybe because they downed like 7 Red Bulls right before they got up there, but they are so overconfident. They're like, I can do this, and I don't even need a parachute, and they just jump out of the plane. No parachute. They're like, I will take this. I will do this. And then, of course, they end up dead. Yeah, they were a little bit rash in that case, right? So you see the difference. A feeling or action that's courageous is one thing, but that feeling or action can go bad in either way. It can be cowardice or it can be rash. And so earlier in this slide, when we say that it's concerned with choice and lies in a mean relative to us in our situation, that's what we're talking about here. You've got to choose. You've got to be morally smart enough to exercise what the proper expression of the virtue is, such that it's not excessive and it's not deficient. Maybe even a good way or a better way to explain that is with the virtue of generosity, because there we can actually think about uh, what's excessive or what's deficient. So, of course we think that it's good to be generous. That's a virtue. That's an important trait that characterizes virtuous people, is that they're generous people. And one of the things about generosity, however, is that kind of like courage in this sense, it's not always the same thing, or at least it's not always, generosity is not always the same amount of money. It's going to depend on the situation, it's going to depend on the context. Again, this line here, it lies in a mean relative to us, lies in a mean relative to us and our situation. There's a relativity, there's a context sensitivity regarding what the proper way is to exercise the virtue. All right, so I want some audience participation here. Um, if you are asked to, you're invited to a 1 year old's birthday party, what would be a proper expression of generosity for that party? If you come, you show up with a gift. Obviously, it's a birthday party, but I don't know what would be an example of what's appropriate for a 1 year old.
Uh, well, not just for the kid. You can bring like drinks or food for the family, like for the party or whatever.
Yeah.
Like provide what's
Hmm.
concessions almost.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. Okay. But think out for the kid though. That's what I have in mind. I mean,
Oh, okay.
You could bring like a
what would
toy for the kid.
okay? Yeah, good. So you bring a toy. How much do you spend on that toy for a 1 year old?
Maybe
10,
10 bucks, 10,
10 or
$15.
15. Yeah.
20.
I hear, I hear 10. Do I hear any more?
I hear
I feel like an audience.
20. I say 20.
Somebody says 20. Okay.
Uh-huh.
All right, 10 to 20 bucks. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you guys a different question now. What if you're invited not to a 1 year old's birthday party, but a close friend's wedding reception? Of course, it's proper protocol to bring a gift. What are you spending on that?
Maybe like
Right.
a household item that's like 50, $30, $50.
It depends
30
on
to
how
50.
close they are.
Okay.
If
Yeah.
it's my best friend, it'd be about $100 probably.
100 bucks. Out.
Okay. So in other words, thank you all for participating. So in other words, the idea, what you're all saying is that you're going to spend a little bit more on a wedding gift than you are a 1 year old's birthday gift. Now, that's very different, isn't it? It's from 20 bucks to 50 and 100 bucks is pretty different, especially percentage wise. I mean, from $10 to $100, it's 1,000% difference between a birthday gift and a uh, wedding gift. And I think that's interesting too. Before I moved even to the state, I lived in a different city, and I attended a few weddings up with my wife, and sort of kind of found out that the general thumb up there, of course, different culture, different place. The general rule of thumb is that you spend $175 per person invited to the wedding. So if it's me and my wife, um, then we're looking at like 350 bucks, um, which is what we did. I mean, that's kind of standard. That's kind of expected. Again, some of this social pressure, if we want to put it that way, that we talked about. So it's different. It's interesting how that generosity itself can be expressed differently in these two different situations, the birthday party and the wedding, but also be expressed differently given sort of various contexts. Uh, Coleman or Birmingham, Alabama, which is where we are right now, versus Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, where I lived some years ago, which is the city I'm talking about. So incredibly different, isn't it? But yet it's all generosity, and that's the thing here, is that generosity is always the right expression, even though generosity itself might look different and be expressed in different ways materially. Okay, so the virtuous one that's figuring out what's the proper way to exercise generosity in this particular situation. That's the rational activity of doing morality for virtue ethics. That's the whole uh, rational activity of the mind stuff that Aristotle is getting at is not figuring out what virtue is, right? It's always right to be courageous and always right to be generous 100% of the time. The more difficult thing, the more mind rational work thing to do is figuring out how do I express generosity correctly in this situation. And that's where it's going to be different. And that's where generosity itself is going to, in some cases, may look a little bit more prodigal or spendthrift, or at least more in that direction in some situations. And in other situations, look more maybe towards the cheap, petty side, even though it isn't, right? But that's just how fluid these things are. This is pretty self-explanatory here on this chart. Indeed, if generosity is one thing, then not being generous in the deficient way is just being cheap. It'd be like, showing up at a wedding of a really friend and uh, putting a $5 bill in a card and leaving it on the gift table. You'd be better off just not to even give anything. It's almost like you're making a statement or something with $5 in an envelope, right? That's how probably most people would think about that. It'd be pretty cheap um, to do that to a friend, or the other defect of excess to totally wipe out your checking account and your retirement account and stick it in a big fat envelope and leave it on the wedding gift table. Especially if you're married and have a family, yeah, your family's not going to appreciate what you did, right? That'd be a prodigal thing to do. That'd be too much, right? And that's not generosity at all. That's a vice. That's a defect, right? You gave way too much because you have other obligations and other things you got to consider there. So being able to strike the mean, as the old school philosophers would talk about, right? Figure out what that mean is, what that proper expression of the virtue is, and we could apply them to all these different ones here on this chart. The same sort of thing. Um, I like examples of truthfulness. Aristotle thinks that being truthful and truth itself is a virtue. Of course, the defect of deficiency is going to be dishonesty. If I'm not telling the truth or the whole truth, I'm being dishonest. Or maybe I go way beyond the truth to where I'm boastful. Or as one distant older family member told me at a family reunion a few years ago about the ins and outs of the hemorrhoid surgery they had, I'm kind of thinking, yeah, this is TMI. This is the defect of excess. This is stuff that, although everything you're saying is truth, I wouldn't have told that, right? You shouldn't be telling me that. And that's just way beyond what's necessary in that situation, especially since we had a really nice meal and that discussion was not sitting well with that meal. But anyway, this is a list of virtues to sort of help us understand so far what's going on. I think at this point I want to stop. We will finish this up in a part 2 that I will have uh, recorded. So let me ask any questions, thoughts, anything that I can clear up or help clarify.
Nope, that should be good. But you raised a lot of questions today. I appreciate it. I'm glad I
Hey,
took this
you're welcome.
class. It's making my brain go crazy.
That's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping for brain pain
Yeah.
and brain craziness,
Yes,
and
yes,
I'm doing my job, I guess.
yes, 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 yes.
Not too much pain. I'm not a sadist here. I don't want to make you guys in too much pain. Just a little bit. A little bit of brain. Well, if no other questions, thoughts on anything, we'll call it a day. I'll have, yeah, we'll call it a day.